afternoon, and welcome to this special program of the Society of Professional Journalists, Should Government Fund Local News? I'm Patti Newberry, SPJ President and a longtime journalism educator. And as surely everyone on this call knows, local news outlets have been in steady decline in both size and in number over the last 15 or 20 years, as audiences have moved online and as advertisers have found other ways to reach their customers. Those trends accelerated dramatically this spring as COVID-19 interrupted revenue streams, and newsrooms reacted with furloughs, with pay cuts, and in some cases, closures. So here we are, halfway through 2020, and small news staffs are even smaller, and news-starved communities are even hungrier. The collective loss is enormous for journalists, for communities, and for our very democracy. Joining me to talk about this crisis and possible remedies are four experts. Frank Blethen is publisher of the Seattle Times and convener of the Save the Press initiative. Jim Friedlich is CEO and executive director of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. Fanny Miller is president of the National Association of Hispanic Publications. And Steve Waldman is president and co-founder of Report for America and leader of Rebuild Local News. So we welcome each of you and we welcome our audience. We'll count on about 45 minutes of conversation and then invite members of the audience to submit questions on the Q&A link at the bottom of their screens. So let's start with brief introductions about each of your various involvements so folks know where you're coming from. Frank, can you start us with an explanation of what Save the Press is?
Well, Save the Press comes from my 25 years of being, as far as I know, the only independent publisher in the country that has been actively in DC and elsewhere lobbying against media consolidation, primarily newspapers, but also issues with the FCC and broadcast. And in that 25 years, watching local news and our free press in general begin a slow spiral down the drain. And but the beginning of the year, we thought that was hitting a crisis point. It's the biggest news and civic story of the past decade, and yet nobody has been covering it. We get episodic coverages, Gatehouse bought this, Sinclair did this. We get that kind of coverage, but nobody's putting it into context. How did this really happen? What's the business models are really like? And I'm one of the few people I think that I run across that talks about this stuff that actually has been running newspapers for 35 years and really understands the model inside and out. And at the end of the day, it's kind of simple. It's two things have brought us to our knees, our overall free press, but which the foundation being the local free press. One is this incredibly egregious consolidation of newspapers and the egregious disinvestment going on in newspapers. Newspapers were never meant to be the plaything of Wall Street. They were supposed to be public service. And the other is the internet, particularly over the last decade, particularly between Facebook and Google, where they have monopolized the digital marketplace and they have gamed search in a way that newspapers and many others cannot run their businesses or make a profit. So, you basically have to reform ownership, and we've got to do some reform in the internet or we're not going to have a free press.
Very good. We'll come back to some of those points, and of course, Google and Facebook in the news this week because of the congressional hearings. Jim, will you tell us about the priorities of Lenfest?
Thank you very much. The Lenfest Institute for Journalism is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are the owner of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which remains a public benefit corporation still operated for profit and a more than $100 million business. To Frank's point, the the idea of the Lenfest Institute was to create a new ownership structure for important public service journalism. Under the nonprofit ownership, the Inquirer must break even, but it does not need to produce egregious profits and dividends for a hedge fund owner. We are a beneficiary of actually deconsolidation. The Inquirer had been owned by Knight Ridder and then fell into the hands of a couple of major hedge funds, Angelo Gordon and Alden Capital. And Jerry Lenfest, who passed away a couple of years ago, a cable mogul who sold his business to Comcast and dedicated his life to philanthropy, bought the paper and then donated it to the nonprofit. So we do two things. We support the Philadelphia Inquirer as a public service news operation, and we give grants and we hope some guidance and support to other organizations like Report for America and the Seattle Times, both of whom we've worked with closely and have great respect for. So I'm very glad to be here, and nice to meet you, Fanny, and nice to meet you, Patti.
Great, thank you. So Fanny, tell us, what is the agenda of the association you lead?
So just a little bit of information on who we are. So of course, good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you. And really nice meeting all of you, ladies and gentlemen. The NAHP is a membership organization. It's a membership organization of mostly local Hispanic-owned publishers. And I say mostly because there's about 90%, probably a little bit more now, 95%, because a lot of the publications that were corporate owned, closed. They went out of business. So right now, about 90%, 95% are Hispanic owned. About 65% are woman owned also. And so nationwide, we have about 200 members, but nationwide, there's about 600 of us publications reaching the Hispanic market or taking care of, our communities. Yes, we are in print, and many of us have adapted or are quickly adapted to new technologies, the online. We are more than publishers. We are employers, taxpayers, businessmen and women. We're confident, we're mentors, and we are very engaged in our communities. We support civic causes, we lead, and we're trusted. Actually, newspapers in the industry of the Hispanic media, newspaper are actually most trusted than TV and radio. And so, we are a very needed communication between our communities. In recent years, we have needed to expand beyond publishing to survive, like we all have. Some of us have transformed our business models to include print, digital, events, festivals, and many other things. Like I mentioned, to the panel, I have been in business for 30 years, well, actually 32 years. And I have been part of the NHP for about the same amount of time, and the NHP is about 35 years old. So in the short answer, yeah, we seek to survive and to succeed, and and to work another day and to continue, just being here for our community. We are in many markets the only ones in those communities, print.
Great, well, welcome. Steve, will you provide some background on Report for America as well as Rebuild Local News?
Thank you for having me. Report for America is a national service program that places journalists into local newsrooms to report on undercovered issues in communities. We have 163 newsroom partners, about evenly split between commercial and nonprofit news organizations. And we just placed 226 reporters into the field in June, including 95 reporters of color. And and by the way, the application window has just opened for news organizations to apply for the next round. There'll be another 100 or so open slots. So any newsrooms that might be interested should contact us or check that out. So Rebuild Local Media is kind of a pop-up coalition that emerged a few months ago from a very diverse group of organizations, including, in fact, everyone on this call. The National Association of Hispanic Publishers, Seattle Times, and Lenfest are all part of this coalition, along with the Institute for Nonprofit News, America's Newspapers, the weekly newspapers, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is the Black newspaper group, and many others I'm sure I'm forgetting. And it was very much born of the idea that this is a moment where we really had to focus on the question of what is the role of government in helping local news. Everyone starts with a deep suspicion and concern about the government getting involved. But the severity of the crisis has made people realize, first of all, the government's already involved. And the question is somewhat, well, what are the policies that they're going to do? And we should be at the table. Our coalition's particular niche is what we call locally owned and nonprofit news. So kind of community grounded news is the heart of it. And so we've been developing long-term proposals, and then most recently have all kind of come together around some specific ideas that we can talk about.
Great. Well, before we move forward to talking about solutions for this moment, what have been some of the underlying trends that have brought us here, right? Maybe we've already referenced some of them, but if you would each articulate, why have we seen over the last decade and a half, maybe going back as long as 20 years, this slow, steady decline, or almost falling off the cliff now in terms of resources devoted to local news? Frank, start with you.
Well, I think you can see it over the last 20, 25 years when, the founding fathers started out with protection and subsidization. Protection started out with the First Amendment. Subsidization was subsidizing Ben Franklin as publisher and creating the post office for ubiquitous distribution. So today, you look at the various protections that evolved over time, anti-competitive issues, marketplace type of issues, including, and this is broad. I mean, it's the broadcast, not just newspapers. Antitrust enforcement. I mean, all of those things have gone by the wayside. And as a family business, I can tell you that one of the real tools was the death tax on family businesses, which is what drove so many of them into selling to outside chains. And we spent years trying to do what the farmers did and getting a death tax exemption for newspaper owners, which could have been a game changer, but that was not in the picture. But it illustrates that what happened was, as owners were forced to sell, or some of them just wanted to cash in, the iteration was, usually it was a newspaper chain. They weren't local. They didn't understand the local. They had some roots in journalism, which was good. But then eventually they became media companies, and the newspaper division became further and further away. And then eventually they became conglomerates, and eventually they became hedge funds, and now we're right into distressed asset players. So it's just this map you can see where we dropped any kind of protection of local media and local newspapers or broadcast. I mean, we got all Sinclair in our market for broadcast. That's a treat. So that there's that path, and the other one then is the rise of the internet. I have in 2010, we were sitting on $20 million. We were early in digital transformation, partly because Microsoft wanted to compete with us and force us into it. And we had $20 million of digital advertising revenue. And we were projecting, we said, by the end of this decade, that should be at least double. We should have 40 million. Well, we got 4 million today. So what happened? What happened was that's where we have put no public service requirements or limitations on the internet, which we actually editorially supported, maybe one of the biggest mistakes we ever made, never envisioning what would happen in this handful of tech companies completely dominating the space to the, in its privacy, it's all sorts of abuses. But, the one I focus on is information and media and newspapers. And we've had no rules or regulations around that. And part of the solution, I won't get into solutions right away, but part of the solution is in reforming ownership, get back to rules that says, you can't have consolidated absentee ownership. You can have variety of models. You can have the for-profit, the local for-profit, the local nonprofit, local hybrids. I mean, as long as you got local and people are invested in local and the mission of journalism locally.
So loss of regulation, rise of the internet, change in the ownership trends. What other big, Jim?
I agree with everything that Frank just said. I think it's also important to be self-critical. Newspapers have not historically been the most innovative businesses, nor have they, for an array of reasons, including those that Frank cited, reinvested actively in their own businesses. So it was not a newspaper that invented Craigslist. It was Craig Newmark. It certainly wasn't a newspaper that invented a neat way to search all of the world's information, which was kind of the role that newspapers could have played. That was Larry Page and Sergey Brin. There are an array of forks in the road that one can look back at and think about what could have been. And the question then is what could be. And if newspapers and other local news organizations, nonprofits as well, can reinvest in these businesses and treat them as growth businesses and have some of the benefits of regulatory and governmental assistance in doing so, that would potentially spell a very different future. So I think we need to figure out what went wrong. To some extent, the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves.
Lack of innovation, lack of quick reaction to the trends.
And if I may, lack of reinvestment. So
right.
to spend just another moment on it, it's absolutely the case that news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, where I came from, have reinvested in their businesses. They've invested in quality journalism, but also in technology. And there was a very early dedication at the Journal in 1996, actually, to the content not being free, to it being a digital subscription model, which was ultimately adopted by all of the rest of us. But we can see that from those national examples that there is a sustainable business model for quality news. And the Seattle Times, for example, has a growing digital subscription business and a growing philanthropic and foundation supported set of businesses for investigative news and coverage of homelessness and growth and education in the city of Seattle. And those things are beginning to really work. And there's reason for some hope, but it has to do with a combination of innovation and reinvestment. And in both cases, there are regulatory issues that would help.
Mm-hmm. Fanny or Steve, would you like to jump in next, still identifying some of the underlying trends that have brought us to this slow decline of the local news business?
I totally, echo on Frank and James' observations. With the Hispanic publishers, what we find that most of the publishers are journalists. They're actually not business people. you know. So a lot of their focus has been on, you know, making sure that the community, the news get out there, you know, the local news. So they have, you know, that's been their focus. And some of them, and more, a lot of us have not been quick enough to move into, you know, the technology part, the growth of the business. Right now, what we are seeing is that we have, even in my board, we're a 17-member board. There's about probably 4 or 5 of the board members that are second generation. So they're coming in to take the business from their parents and some from their grandparents, and they're making all these changes. So, you know, we're seeing that energy, which is a good energy for some of the ones that have been here longer. But, you know, just like any business, I believe print, it's a hard business, but I haven't found a business that is an easy business, you know. So we just, you know, we have been very slow, you know, when it comes to the comments that Frank and Jim mentioned, to just, you know, get up on the wagon of you know, where the advertising went. So in the organization, that's what we're focusing right now. The other good thing that I think has happened right now with not only, you know, our industry, but also, you know, the situation that we're living, is that different organizations were coming together to work, you know, more in a solid way. You know, before I didn't see that happen. You know, I have never seen, you know, different, you know, the Black press, the Asian press, the different, you know, the alternative press, all of us coming together to say, okay, you know, we are the ones that put out the news. You know, Google doesn't put out news. We all put out the news. You know, we're the ones that are writing the news. So, you know, working with some of these other organizations and the you know, media out there on the social media, it's very important for us also to find ways of how we're going to both benefit, because they need us. And I think that's one of the things that we haven't really put out there, is that we're needed in their business model.
Right, most certainly. Steve, what have we missed?
I don't think we missed anything. I'll just underline one thing that others have said, which is that, you know, at first, when the digital disruption was happening, there was a lot of discussion about how local news was messing up because they were losing their readers to the internet. And I think really, if you look back at it, the big problem, the big attack on the business model was not that local news was losing readers, it was that they were losing advertisers. And that was really what broke the business model, was that businesses and communities found themselves better served in some cases, at least in their view, by going to Google and Facebook and Monster.com and Cars.com and various other ways that they can reach consumers. That for up until that point, through all of the media history of the United States, there had been an assumption that if you were a business and you wanted to reach a certain type of content, a certain type of customer, that the way you would do that would be to associate with a certain type of content. It wasn't that they necessarily cared about the content, it was just that being next to that content was how you reached a certain type of person. And the internet completely changed that. Now, all of a sudden, you could reach a certain type of consumers in all sorts of ways, completely unrelated to content. And that really, you know, knocked the bottom out of the business models on the local level.
Right, and we've been talking about that for a very long time now, and so it seems like solutions are elusive. So let's move to this concept of solutions and talk about what has been on the table, what is on the table now, what seems to have some momentum now in terms of solutions for local news. And I'll just throw out the usual list, and then you guys can pick your favorites to discuss. Having news organizations owned by foundations, having news organizations owned by philanthropic enterprises, having sponsorships, having membership-based audiences, collaborating, that's getting a lot of conversation right now, instead of competing with various other news organizations, figuring out ways to collaborate and share resources, and so on and so forth. And of course, you know, trying to make Google and Facebook pay when they pick up and repurpose the news that journalists put out there. So who would like to start off with what they see as where is the conversation on solutions right now? What are people talking most about as viable ways forward?
Well, when the model, the business or the model, profit, nonprofit, foundation funded, whatever, is different, I think, somewhat than talking about the solutions, because the solutions will apply no matter what the ownership form is. I mean, the position we take, we the Seattle Times, is that we think the more models, the better. Because different models are going to work for different communities, and we still think that the best model is the one that has an ownership person or group deeply connected with their community and committed to the kind of service that's supposed to happen. And then when you get beyond that, we look at it that there's still two primary revenue streams, even though we've been able to find some additional add-ons, and sometimes those come and go. But it used to be advertising and audience as an add-on. Now it's primarily audience, but advertising is still very, very important. And one point I wanted to make was that when you look at the loss of advertising, we're real quick today to talk about it's all internet, but it wasn't all internet. When we talk about consolidation of newspapers, and broadcast, it's been consolidation of mainstream America now for 30, 35 years. And the fact that we have allowed, we have a single family drugstore left in Washington State.
Wow.
And we keep close track of them because they're the only continuous business, we believe, on this side of the mountains that is actually older than we are. So we've had them as a customer for 124 years. But it's a local family deeply committed to the community. They could have made a fortune selling out to one of the big drug chains, and they just refused to do it. But you see that in car dealerships, grocery stores, everywhere. And the biggest impact is the smaller the community. We own rural papers in Yakima and Walla Walla, about 30,000 and 10,000 circulation. And we've watched over the last 30 years, the retail in those small markets is just not there. It's no longer worth it to these big box stores to do what they used to do. So, there is something about, this consolidation thing that's gone on in America has been incredibly damaging, not just to newspapers, but to the people who should be our customers.
Your neighbors there in Seattle, Amazon.com has been a big part of that. It's innovation as value destruction.
Yeah, it does. But they're sort of the ice. I don't want to make a positive reference, but they're sort of the piling on now. Now that the consolidators have removed most of the storefronts, now they're kind of piling on with what's left, because you can order anything from them.
As we all know, being home and having the Amazon truck come down the street every day. So Frank, you say the more business models, the better, and the best in your estimation is the owner with strong ties to the community, and still what's working for you in Seattle is a combination of audience revenue and advertising revenue. So let's play off of that. What are the conversations right now in terms of the viable ways forward? Frank's model, what are some of the other models?
Well, I think it's important, again, to point to some of the positive developments around audience revenue and what the potential of that is. The sea change amongst for-profit, nonprofit journalism has been support by individual users, individual readers. They can be called members, they can be called subscribers. And when they're kind of super users, We call them donors or even foundations. So individuals paying for journalism that they care about, that gives them value, is the broadest trend. We found that, and you're right, Philadelphia is a very specific place. Jerry Lenfest, as a donor, was a very specific and unusual person. God bless him. But we found that if we invested in the community, if we put more money into investigative news, into State House coverage, and into news that mattered and holds power to account, that the community would reward us. So our endowment now, our support, is about 3 times what Jerry initially donated. And that seems to be the case in different places, in different amounts, in different ways. Independent of business model. Frank's newspaper is a for-profit newspaper, but they do very well in asking for and getting foundation support. And the Salt Lake Tribune has now converted to a full-scale nonprofit and seems to be making some progress on that. So the growth business, if there is one in local news, is nonprofits. The largest of which is the Texas Tribune, but there's one emerging in pretty much every state. We launched one called Spotlight PA, which is Harrisburg, and now the largest and most diverse bureau in the capital of Pennsylvania. There's Cal Matters, there's Vermont Digger. And what's great about Report for America is that my sense is you're agnostic. You'll see quality news operations with quality reporters, many of them diverse, irrespective of business model.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you're right that it points to sort of hybrid models that have been created. I agree that I think the nonprofit sector as a factor in local news is growing and needs to grow. But that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't only mean a foundation owning a newspaper or a completely, brand new nonprofit startup, though it often does. Like in the case of Report for America, we'll place reporters into commercial newsrooms as well as nonprofit newsrooms. But just injecting a nonprofit sensibility and money into a commercial newsroom actually has positive benefits. We had this, I remember when we had 2 reporters in the Chicago Sun-Times, and Chris Fusco, the managing editor, was interviewed, I think, in a piece about us in the Columbia Journalism Review. And he said, we'd really love it if we could take Manny and Carlos, the 2 reporters, and put them just on covering crime. But we couldn't because we promised Report for America that we wouldn't do that. And I could tell even by reading through the lines that he had a little twinkle in his eye when he said that, because he liked being forced. His proposal to us was, we want them to cover everything except crime in the South Side of Chicago. And they wanted to do better at covering the real community issues that always got ignored, because the only time the Sun-Times ever covered the South Side was around crime. And they recognized that. This is new ownership, so they were happy to throw the previous people under the bus. But they recognized that, and it was a real kind of awakening moment for me, because it really made me realize that there's not a bright line between a nonprofit sensibility and a commercial sensibility these days. The commercial entities that are going to survive are going to be the ones like the Seattle Times that have a service mentality and have a very local mentality. And conversely, the nonprofits that are going to survive are the ones that have good business management, that aren't just doing it because it's from their heart and they want to do good. Those aren't going to survive. So there's a kind of a convergence around those 2 things, that the for-profits that survive are looking in a much different way about serving their audience, and the nonprofits are hopefully looking at a different way about how do we make this sustainable.
Very interesting. And it sounds like from all 3 of you, one of the commonalities is delivering quality journalism that really meets the needs of the community, responds to the community, So you have something to sell. Fanny, your members, you indicated earlier, in general, some of your members have been slower to pick up on the technological opportunities to expand into internet and related. So what's been working to keep your papers going?
So we have always, our and I could just speak, for myself, we have always been community newspapers. I remember years ago that I was in one of the conference for ANN, and here in San Diego, and it was a publishers, and it was where all the industry was changing, and they were talking about all these big changes, and some of them came on stage and talked about their big changes in their publications that they were doing, mostly dailies. And they said that they were doing two things. They were doing really local news, and then they were doing target distribution. Well, that's what we have always been doing. We have always been target distribution, and we have always been local news. So right now, just to answer the question that we were talking a little bit earlier, what are we doing? What do we think are the solutions are? Definitely we need more resources for technology. We need to, get on the bandwagon of technology faster. But that's not that we're going to leave or we're going to close our publications. The publications are always going to be there. It's a need in many of our communities and in most of our communities. Every week we're having a call, and the collaboration is definitely a plus. For us to collaborate together, that's definitely, so we could also have the same message. I saw years ago that all the, the general market print would always talk really bad about their market. They were always the ones that would, bring down and say how bad they were doing. With the Hispanic market, we have not done that. We actually have been steady, and there's some markets that we have growth. I mean, there's like in North Carolina, there's like about 6 different publications or more. So there's what you call the emerging markets that are actually growing in the Hispanic market. So for us to collaborate, not only as members, to have the same message, but also, with other organizations. Every week we have the call with NMPA, with AAN, LMC, and Lions. So there's about 5, and we come together and we're doing all these things, talking to Google, talking to, some of the foundations. So I think that's really important for us to continue that, to work together. But definitely the technology part, there's some grants in California that are coming down, for a foundation for technology, for publications that want to, do more in technology. So we're looking for all that for our members. And I definitely think the two things is to work together to also have the same message. And when it comes to the government, we are asking them to advertise with us more, for have more federal advertising. In the Hispanics, we get really nothing from the federal government when it comes to advertising. So those are the things that, we want to work on and that we're working on.
The federal government's budget, this includes the census advertising, the armed services, many of which are targeting Latinx communities and not putting their money where their mouth is. So that's a wonderful idea.
The federal government spends $1 billion on advertising every year, and very little of it goes through local media. So one of the proposals that we've been pushing in the Rebuild Local Media Coalition is that at least half of what the federal government spends ought to go through local media.
And why do we like that? $500 million is $500 million, obviously, but the goal is to find ways to take advantage of government support, regulatory change, and largesse without direct influence over the content. So the difference between becoming a part of the census ad campaign and having the local government write a check directly to the Seattle Times, so long as they like what Frank's publishing, is huge. So it's an acceptable form of government support with independence built in.
Right, so that sets us up nicely here to move to the central question, which is government support for local news. You've just cited one of the leading ideas that Steve has just mentioned, the $1 billion in advertising spending a year comes from government entities for advertising or potentially for advertising. Steve, kick off this part of our conversation with a little bit more of that. Who says it's $1 billion, and what does that advertising look like? Where does it go now? Just tell us some more about that.
Well, that comes from the General Accounting Office. The GAO estimates that it's $1 billion. Each year it's a little bit different, but the largest ones are the Pentagon and the census, but then there's also public health advertising, education advertising, and a lot of it goes to network news, network, national media campaigns. Some goes to social media. And so just requiring them to be looking at local sources would be could be a really significant change. Now there's other ways to do that. And, to get to the kind of the heart of the question of whether or not it makes sense for the government to be involved in this at all, I'm guessing that everyone on this call would have the same answer is yes, but yes, it is an appropriate role for the government in theory and under certain circumstances. But if you do it the wrong way, it can be quite damaging. So we're all, I think, of the same line of it really matters how you do this. I don't think any of us are taking the position of no, absolutely not. Because the fact is the government already does support the media and already does affect it. It's just a matter of the question is how. So for instance, there's a bill that has gotten at least our coalition very excited and is really kind of rallying a very, very broad group of people around it, called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. Kirkpatrick Newhouse, Congressman Kirkpatrick from Arizona, a Democrat, and Dan Newhouse, a Republican from Washington, have proposed this bill that I like very much because I think it threads this needle of how do you provide significant support for local media without running into the problems that Jim was talking about of government, messing up editorial independence or the First Amendment. And the reason I think it's really interesting is that instead of focusing the emphasis on the government or people in the government sitting around who deciding how to give out grants and which media organization ought to get things, is it actually empowers consumers and businesses to help local media. So it gives a $250 tax credit to Americans for the purpose of buying a newspaper subscription or for the purpose of making a donation to a local news nonprofit. So it's not someone at the Secretary of Local News in Washington making the decision. It's Americans making the decisions for themselves, but it could pump a huge amount of money into local news in a very constructive way. There's a second provision that actually is about advertising. It gives $5,000 to local small businesses to advertise in local media. And I love that idea because it helps local media. It also helps local businesses get up, back on their feet by reaching out to their customers. I think it's going to be far more likely, by the way, that Hispanic publishers and others like that would benefit from that kind of an approach than a national top-down approach, because these businesses are in the community and it'll be easier for folks like Hispanic publishers to reach out to people to make the case for why they ought to be part of it. So those are two really good examples of how a public policy can be constructed in a way that would really help local media, but without the potentially damaging parts of this. And by the way, this is a very live issue. Like right now, we're trying to get this bill to be included in the COVID relief package in the next week. So if you're interested in this, go to rebuildlocalnews.org and read the letter and sign up and weigh in, because the news industry is in a terrible crisis right now, and we do need help. And if there are ways of doing it that can be constructive instead of destructive, we should be really rallying around it.
Let's hear some other thoughts on the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, HR 7640, from our other panelists.
Well, I'll chime in. We've been involved in it and are very familiar with it. It is as Steve knows, some of us, along with Gene Kimmelman and a couple others, have been talking primarily to some Washington State delegation members. And for us, the most important idea in this really comes out of some of the things we had been kicking around, although we weren't directly involved with this, was, and that is the support for journalists and creating, we've got to stop this tsunami of layoffs in newsrooms. You know, we don't need more news deserts. We don't need, and even worse is the number of ghosts. We have, by my count, and I'm being conservative, 5 ghost newspapers in Washington State today, which is just, you know, unbelievable to me. But
Hey, Frank, what is a ghost newspaper? You might want to elaborate on what that means.
You know, a news desert is where there's simply no newspaper left or no newspaper reaching that community. Ghost newspaper is more insidious. That's a newspaper that has been so disinvested in, not only in content, but in delivery service, whether it's I'm gonna watch my language, a bad website or home delivery, but the disinvestment in the service. And you're lucky if, even in a paper with maybe 25, 30, 40,000 circulation left, you're lucky if you get 2 or 3 halfway decent local stories in it on a day. And it's basically just filled with fodder that they get from other papers in their chain or something else. They're not relevant. And we can tell these 5 newspapers in Washington State, you can see what's happened to them in their circulation, just, you know, and it's not because people don't want newspapers. But what this does is it would go a long ways towards stopping the layoffs and preserving newsrooms. And even in these ghost newspapers, we want to preserve the newsrooms because most of them are chain owned or hedge fund owned, and those guys are going to walk away from these in the next 12 to 24 months. And you want to be able to have some kind of an infrastructure that then could be taken over locally. And you want to be, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
Does this legislation have a provision that would protect selfies?
There's a provision that provides tax credits for the hiring of local journalists.
Or the retention of local journalists helps to cover the salaries of journalists. Yep.
And it gives us, the first year is very significant, which is important because that'll stop a lot of the layoffs. But then as a 4-year runaway, and it terminates. And the 4-year runaway, the tax credit is reduced in half, but it's still significant enough, and it's for newsroom employment. So you still have to figure out how do you fund the rest of your operation. So, which is a good discipline people should definitely have. But this is, we've done a lot of analysis on this, and in terms of stabilizing newsrooms and giving a runway for more reform, this is the closest thing to a deal changer out there.
Excellent. Fanny, are your members aware of this, and are they on board?
I know we signed the letter, and not totally. This is something new that you know just came up to our organization, but you know, some of them, the board is aware of it, and you know we totally support it. I think we just need to really understand the benefits of it and to let our members know the benefits of it.
And Steve, since your group is pushing it, I assume that you've got a dissection of it on your site that people could go to get more information, right? And what you alluded to this week or this coming week being an important moment for this bill. Can you fill us in a little bit there?
Yeah, so we do have a breakdown on the site. I mean, one thing that's nice about this bill is it is pretty simple and straightforward. It's got these 3 components: tax credit for jobs, tax credit for subscription, and tax credit for advertising. That's it. It's very it's straightforward. The opportunity is that the Senate is now considering the next COVID relief bill. And we view this as part of the COVID crisis. You know, the disinformation that is on 2 levels. One is that disinformation has been one of the worst parts of the COVID crisis. And so the collapse of local news makes combating the the COVID epidemic harder. And second, of course, is that the news industry, which is already in a lot of trouble, has been further devastated by COVID. All the businesses that we're talking about having been closed for 3 months, a lot of them are advertisers. And so it's, we're trying to make the case that this should be viewed as part of the COVID crisis. There'll be other opportunities, no doubt, to be advocating these solutions. But right now, we're trying to get senators to look at it that way. In the long run, we're also building up support on the, trying to build up support on the House side. But in the next 10 days, 2 weeks or something like that, there's a window of an opportunity to try to get this into the Senate COVID relief bill.
Okay, super. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to SPJ Executive Director John Schertzer to share the questions with us.
And you'd like questions in Q&A or in chat?
In the Q&A would be best, thanks.
Q&A. Yeah, so one question here is about tribal media outlets. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts around that, but they are, the questioner is saying they are funded by governments, which restricts their reporting. And would the bill help tribal media obtain funding so they can become independent of tribal control?
Well, I think they'd qualify, wouldn't they, Steve? But I don't know that that's going to give them the independence they want.
Yeah, I think I think of this as being a kind of short-term, long-term. I think that we all kind of feel like this is a moment, almost maybe akin to the 1967 when the Public Broadcasting Act was created, where in the next 12 months, we as a society need to look anew and in a very grand way about what the role the government has in local media. It's a really important conversation. It's going to happen pretty quickly, I think, especially depending on what the election results are. And that question that this questioner raised should be part of that discussion. It's not directly addressed in this particular, in the Kirkpatrick-Newhouse bill, but those publications would be helped potentially by, well, all three of those provisions in terms of helping to sustain journalism, and in terms of if they have subscribers, it could help them get more subscribers. And if they have advertisers, it can help get more of them.
Do we have a point of view as to whether Biden, do we know where Biden or any of his potential vice presidential picks? I'd seen some early legislative proposals from Elizabeth Warren as much as a year ago, including this tax credit for a subscription idea. I'm curious if anyone has any sense.
Jim, we have reason to believe that he is very aware of what's going on and is very sympathetic.
The most recent outreach I had from a foundation, I've heard from foundations and from unhappy newspaper consumers, some of them quite wealthy, all around the country about whether they could apply our model of nonprofit ownership of local news. And the most recent, before COVID brought us into the house, was in Delaware. And there's, I think, a couple of Gannett papers in Delaware that are ghost or zombie newspapers. And so right there in Vice President Biden's home state, there's an effort to revitalize local news.
You know, that another idea that's not in this bill, but Frank and I know have talked about this, is the concept, and it's really very almost modeled after what you all did at Lenfest and with the Philadelphia Inquirer, is the idea of what I've been calling replanting newspapers that might be currently part of private equity funds and either converting them to nonprofit status or replanting them into local nonprofit organizations or into local owners. So there's 6,000 plus newspapers in America right now. And if we could design public policies and philanthropic policies that would enable those to convert and become more locally grounded, whether it's a nonprofit model or a public benefit corporation or something like that, that would be a way of harnessing what is all, in many cases, still, you know, real reach and business and advertiser commitments and brand in these newspapers before it's too late, because some of them are too far gone, frankly, and And the longer we wait and the more hemorrhaging we have, the more of them will be too far gone. But I think looking at this question of consolidation, I think you used the term, Jim, deconsolidation. We should really have a conscious, deliberate strategy for deconsolidation. What are the ways that a combination of government policy and philanthropic interest could manifest in a successful deconsolidation strategy?
Very interesting. We do have a few more questions in the queue. John, would you take another one for us?
Sure. There's just a general question here that I think would be good to get opinions on is, what do you think the likelihood of these government initiatives are in passing or getting put into place? Is this going to be successful? And how confident do you feel about that?
I'd say the odds right now are small, to be honest. Not necessarily because people don't like the cause. It's just a very difficult environment and very hard to know how to break through, but it's a meaningful enough that we're all think it's very, very much worth the effort. And in the longer run, and by longer run, I mean like 12 months, not 12 years, I think there's a pretty good chance that something good could happen. That obviously will depend a lot on the election results, to be honest, both for the Senate and in the White House. But there are serious senators and Congress people working on major pieces of legislation around local news right now. Yeah, and with very ambitious pieces of legislation. So that, that tells me that there's some real momentum to be seriously thinking about it.
Yeah, I agree completely with Steve. And I would just say, even though it's a real long shot, if we could get this Kirkpatrick Newhouse bill on the passed, that would be huge. But everything we're doing is also to educate. This has been a real education journey, I think, the last few months for members of the House and Senate. And the more we can get them educated on what a crisis it is, especially where we can get I spent a lot of time calling locally owned newspapers around the country to coach them into talking to their senator or congressperson. Because a lot of times they may hear somebody bitch or complain, but they're not really hearing somebody who understands their system. So I think if we can get enough energy behind this and enough education, I agree with Steve, the next 12 months could be really useful.
Very much. Well, we will continue the conversation as we watch that piece of legislation. And with that, we need to bring the conversation to a close. So thank you to Fanny, to Frank, to Jim, and Steve for providing a really good, some very good education for all of our members. And we appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.